My husband didn't just leave me for a younger woman. He spent 12 years turning our marriage into a multi-million-dollar heist. I'm standing in our Malibu mansion, but the locks have already been changed. Every bank account? Drained. My career? Sabotaged. And that serene eggshell white on the walls? It's the only thing left of the life he stole. But Mark made one fatal mistake. He thinks he's the architect of this disappearance. He doesn't realize I've already found the one file he forgot to encrypt. A file that proves he didn't just cheat, he committed a crime that will put him away for life. There's a black SUV idling at the bottom of my driveway right now. They aren't the police. And if I don't upload this data in the next 60 seconds, I might not make it out of this house alive. They say that in the moments before a massive earthquake, the animals go silent. The birds stop their chatter, the dogs retreat to the shadows, and the air itself grows heavy, as if the earth is holding its breath before it screams. My life didn't end with a scream. It ended with a quiet click, the sound of a door locking from the outside. I'm sitting in a cafe in Santa Monica today. The sun is aggressive, bleeding through the glass, warming the mahogany table where my latte has gone cold. I look like any other woman in a navy silk blouse, perhaps waiting for a friend or scrolling through a grocery list. But I am a ghost. I am the woman who died 6 months ago in a lawyer's office, and the person speaking to you now is the one who climbed out of the grave to see who was dancing on it. Mark was my North Star. That sounds cliché, doesn't it? Like something written on a Hallmark card by someone who has never actually been lost at sea. But for 12 years, I navigated every storm by looking at him. We met in San Francisco, during a summer where the fog felt like a velvet blanket. I was an aspiring curator, he was a rising star in corporate restructuring. He was brilliant at it, taking broken things, stripping them down to their essentials, and making them profitable again. I should have realized then that he viewed people the same way he viewed companies. Our wedding was in Napa. I remember the scent of fermenting grapes and expensive lavender. I remember the way he held my hand, not with a squeeze of passion, but with the firm grip of a man who had just acquired a prized asset. At the time, I called it security. I called it being cherished. I didn't know that I was just the cornerstone of a facade he was building for the world to admire. If you are listening to this right now, perhaps you feel that same cold wind on the back of your neck. Perhaps you're looking at your partner across the dinner table and wondering why their smile doesn't reach their eyes anymore. If you feel that intuition, do not ignore it. It is the only part of you that isn't lying to you. Before I tell you how I found the first thread of his lies, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel. Right now. Don't think about it. If you hesitate, it's because you're afraid to hear the truth of what happens when the people we trust most turn into strangers. And for those of you who won't subscribe, go to the comments. Tell the world why you'd rather stay blind. Tell us why you think you're exempt from the darkness. I'll wait. Our house in the hills was a masterpiece of glass and light. Mark insisted on floor-to-ceiling windows. He said he loved the transparency. Irony has a way of twisting the knife, doesn't it? In a house of glass, you'd think it would be impossible to hide anything. But a mirror is also glass, and if you angle it just right, you can hide a whole other world behind a reflection. The first crack wasn't a lipstick stain or a secret phone. It was a change in the air. Mark started coming home with a certain vibration. He was energized, but not by me. He would talk about the project. Everything was the project. A new merger, a new acquisition, a series of late-night meetings at a satellite office in Irvine. I remember one Tuesday evening. The sun was dipping below the horizon, turning the California sky into a bruised purple. I had made a bœuf bourguignon, the kind that takes 6 hours of slow simmering. I wanted us to sit, to talk, to find that rhythm we used to have when we were poor and lived in a one-bedroom apartment with a view of a brick wall. Mark walked in at 9 p.m. He didn't smell like perfume. He smelled like ozone and expensive scotch. He looked at the table, looked at me, and his face didn't register guilt. It registered annoyance. I ate at the office, Tina, he said. He didn't even take off his coat. You shouldn't have waited. My time isn't my own right now. I didn't wait for your hunger, Mark, I whispered. I waited for you. He laughed then. It was a short, barking sound. Don't be domestic, Tina. It doesn't suit the lifestyle we've built. That was the night I realized I wasn't his partner. I was his lifestyle. I was a piece of furniture that had begun to speak, and he found the noise distracting. I spent the next month observing. I became a scientist in my own home. I noted the way he tilted his phone screen away from me, not with a jerk, but with a slow, casual drift. I noted the way he started exercising at 5 a.m., his body becoming leaner, harder, as if he were preparing for a hunt. I went through his pockets once. Just once. I felt like a criminal, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would bruise. I found a receipt for a jewelry boutique in Beverly Hills. Not a diamond, a sapphire pendant. I waited for my birthday. I waited for our anniversary. I waited for Christmas. The sapphire never appeared on my neck. I saw it 3 months later on a social media post. Not his. He was too smart for that. It was on the neck of a woman tagged in a photo at a corporate gala I hadn't been invited to. Sarah. A junior executive. She was 26, with the kind of blonde hair that looks like it's never known a day of frizz, and a smile that said she had never been told no in her entire life. She was wearing my husband's sapphire, and she was leaning into his space with the casual arrogance of a woman who knew she had already won. The divorce was a surgical strike. Mark didn't fight for me. He fought for the assets. He sat across from me in a conference room that smelled of stale coffee and expensive leather, and he talked about equitable distribution as if he were liquidating a failing grocery store. "Let's be adults about this, Tina," he said. He was wearing a new watch. Platinum. Sarah's influence, no doubt. We've outgrown each other. It happens in California. People change. Lives evolve. "You didn't evolve, Mark," I said, my voice so cold it felt like dry ice in my throat. "You just traded in an old model for a newer one before the lease was up." He didn't flinch. He just pushed a folder toward me. "The house is yours for 6 months. After that, it's sold. You get 40% of the liquid assets. It's more than enough for a woman of your interests." My interests. He meant my silence. He meant my disappearance. He wanted me to take the money and vanish into a quiet apartment in some forgotten corner of the state, to become a footnote in the grand biography of Mark Harrison. I signed the papers. I didn't cry. Not in front of him. I watched him walk out of that room, his stride confident, his future bright and untethered. I stayed in that chair for an hour after everyone left. The sun moved across the floor, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. I realized then that I had been a ghost in that marriage long before the papers were filed. I had allowed myself to be carved away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a shell that served his needs. But here is the thing about being a ghost: you can go places the living can't. You can see things they think are hidden. You can wait in the shadows while they celebrate their stolen victories. I went home to our glass house that night. I didn't pack. I didn't scream. I went to the cellar and opened the most expensive bottle of wine we owned, a bottle we had been saving for a special occasion. I poured it down the sink. Every drop. I started to plan. Not a legal battle, that was over. I started to plan my presence. I knew Mark's world. I knew the people who kept his secrets and the people who envied his success. I knew that in the high-stakes world of California finance, reputation is a fragile thing. It's a porcelain mask. It looks strong, but if you hit the right frequency, it shatters. I heard about the wedding 3 weeks after the decree was absolute. It was fast. Obediently fast. A shotgun wedding, the gossips whispered at the gym. Sarah was pregnant. The timeline didn't just overlap, it collided. He had been planning his new life while I was still picking out the thread count for our sheets. I received the invitation by accident. Mark's mother, a woman who had mastered the art of the passive-aggressive slight, sent it to the house. "Tina, I thought you should have closure. Mark is so happy. We all are." Closure. They wanted me to witness their joy so they could feel absolved of their cruelty. They wanted to see me flinch so they could tell themselves I was the bitter one, the broken one. I looked at that invitation, cream-colored cardstock with gold-embossed lettering. The marriage of Mark Harrison and Sarah Jenkins. I didn't burn it. I didn't throw it away. I placed it on my vanity and looked at my reflection. I had lost 10 pounds. My eyes looked larger, deeper. There was a stillness in me now that hadn't been there before. I decided then. I would go. I wouldn't go to beg. I wouldn't go to cry. I would go because a wedding is a public performance, and I wanted to see the actors up close. I wanted to see the cracks in the stage. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that there would be a guest there. A man from Mark's deepest past. And he was going to say something to the groom during the reception. A single, 7-word sentence that would turn Mark's face the color of bone and start the clock on a destruction he could never have imagined. If you think you know how this ends, you're wrong. You're as wrong as Mark was when he thought I was finished. Stay with me. Because the first hour of his new life was the beginning of the end of everything. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a divorce. It isn't peaceful. It's a loud, ringing void, like the sound in your ears after a bomb goes off. I lived in that silence for the first few weeks in his Malibu house. Every room felt like an accusation. The minimalist furniture we'd picked out together in Milan now looked like skeletal remains. The walls, painted a serene eggshell white, felt like they were closing in, mocking me with their blankness. I found myself walking through the house at 3 a.m., my bare feet cold on the polished concrete floors. I was looking for something. A stray hair, a forgotten cufflink, a scent of his cologne trapped in the velvet curtains. I wasn't looking because I missed him, I was looking because I needed to prove to myself that the last 12 years weren't a hallucination. How could a man occupy so much space in your soul and then vanish without leaving a single footprint? That was the first stage of the conflict, the war within myself. My mind was a courtroom where I was both the prosecutor and the defendant. How did you not see it? The prosecutor would scream. I trusted him, the defendant would whisper. Trust is just another word for laziness, the verdict would come down. I began to realize that the person I was mourning wasn't Mark. Mark was alive and well, probably feeding Sarah organic strawberries in a penthouse somewhere. The person I was mourning was me. The Tina who believed in forever. The Tina who thought that if you worked hard enough and loved deep enough, the world would be fair. That woman was dead. And her ghost was making a mess of my life. I stopped looking for cufflinks and started looking for data. I am a researcher by nature. You don't curate high-end art galleries without knowing how to dig into the provenance of a piece. I needed to know the provenance of Mark's betrayal. I sat in the dark of the home office, the blue light of the monitor etching lines into my face. I didn't have his passwords, he changed those months ago, but I had something better, 12 years of shared history. I knew his patterns. I knew the names of the shell companies he used for tax optimization. I knew the names of his associates who liked to brag over expensive dinners. I began to map out the timeline. It wasn't just Sarah. It was the money. I noticed a pattern of withdrawals starting 18 months before the divorce. Small amounts at first, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, disguised as consulting fees or travel expenses. But as the months progressed, the numbers grew. He wasn't just leaving me, he was bleeding our joint life dry to hydrate his new one. I found a credit card statement I hadn't seen before, tucked into the back of an old filing cabinet. It was for a private bank in the Caymans. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. This wasn't just an affair. This was a heist. The first real confrontation didn't happen in person. It happened over a cold, professional email. I had sent him a screenshot of the Cayman statement with a single question: is this part of the equitable distribution, Mark? 10 minutes later, my phone rang. I didn't answer. I wanted to hear him struggle with the voicemail. Tina, don't be a child, his voice crackled through the speaker. He sounded annoyed, the way a father sounds when a toddler breaks a vase. That account is related to a private investment group. It has nothing to do with you. If you start digging into things you don't understand, you're only going to make this harder on yourself. Take the settlement and go. Don't turn this into a melodrama. Melodrama. That's what men call it when women start demanding the truth. It's a way of making your pain feel small and hysterical. But I wasn't feeling hysterical. I was feeling cold. A beautiful, crystalline coldness was settling over my heart. I realized then that the conflict wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that he still thought he could control me. He thought he could snap his fingers and I would scurry away into the fog. He didn't realize that by taking everything from me, he had inadvertently freed me. I had nothing left to lose, and a woman with nothing to lose is the most dangerous creature in California. I drove to his new office building the next day. I didn't go in. I just sat in the parking lot, watching the glass doors. It was a temple of ego, all steel and sharp angles. I saw them at lunch. Mark and Sarah. They walked out into the bright California sun, and for a moment, the world felt like it was tilting. She was wearing a cream-colored maternity dress that looked like it cost more than my first car. Her hand was rested on her stomach, a gesture that felt less like a mother's love and more like a trophy display. Mark had his arm around her, his head tilted down to catch whatever she was saying. He looked light. As if he had shed a heavy skin. I watched him open the car door for her. The same car he'd told the lawyers was essential for business and therefore exempt from the split. I watched him kiss her temple. A wave of nausea hit me, followed by a searing, white-hot heat. It wasn't jealousy. It was the sheer, unadulterated injustice of it. He was rewarded for his cruelty. He got the girl, the baby, the car, and the secret accounts, while I got a half-empty house and a melodrama tag. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My wedding ring, the one I hadn't been able to take off yet, felt like a hot brand against my skin. I looked at it. The diamond was small, tasteful. I remembered him saying it represented our solid foundation. I took it off. It didn't come easily. I had to use my own saliva to slide it over the joint. I held it in my palm for a second, then I threw it into the glove compartment among the old napkins and spare change. I wasn't a wife anymore. I wasn't a victim. I was an observer. And I was going to observe them until I found the crack in their foundation. I spent the next few days in a state of hyperfocus. I stopped eating real meals, surviving on black coffee and the adrenaline of my own anger. I started reaching out to friends. You know the kind, the people who orbit power and trade in secrets. I called Marcus, a former business partner of Mark's who had been restructured out of the firm 3 years ago. Marcus hated Mark with a quiet, simmering passion that matched my own. "Tina," he said, his voice wary. "I heard about the split. I'm sorry. Mark is Mark. I don't want sympathy, Marcus," I said. "I want to know about the project. The one he's been working on in Irvine." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Tina, stay away from that. That's not just business. It's a house of cards. Mark is over-leveraged. He's been moving money to keep the optics looking good for the wedding. He needs Sarah's family's connections to bail him out." My heart skipped. Sarah's family. They weren't just new money, they were the Jenkins family. Real estate royalty in the valley. "He's marrying a bank," I whispered. "He's marrying a lifeline," Marcus corrected. "If that wedding doesn't go off without a hitch, Mark is looking at a massive default. He's betting everything on that ceremony." This was the missing piece. The urgency. The shotgun wedding wasn't just about the baby. It was about survival. Mark wasn't just in love with Sarah, he was in debt to her world. And he was terrified that I would find out. I went back to the house and looked at the invitation again. The marriage of Mark Harrison and Sarah Jenkins. It wasn't a celebration of love. It was a merger. A closing ceremony. And then, I saw it. A small detail I had missed before. The guest list wasn't just friends and family. It included the entire board of directors from his firm. He was using his wedding to prove his stability to the people who were suspicious of his books. But there was one name on that list that didn't fit. A man named Arthur Vance. I recognized the name from Mark's old journals, a mentor from 20 years ago who had disappeared after a scandal. Why was he coming back now? I picked up my phone and sent one more email to Mark. No screenshots this time. No questions. "I'll be at the wedding, Mark. See you in the front row." I watched the read receipt turn blue almost instantly. I waited for the frantic call, the legal threats, the begging. Nothing came. Instead, 5 minutes later, a black SUV pulled into my driveway. 2 men in suits got out. They didn't look like lawyers. They looked like the kind of people who make problems go away in the middle of the night. The early conflict was over. The war had officially begun. The black SUV sat at the foot of my driveway like a predator in repose. I stood behind the reinforced glass of my living room window, my fingers tracing the cold surface. I didn't call the police. In Mark's world, the police were just another department you could negotiate with if the price was right. No, these men weren't here to arrest me. They were here to measure the depth of my resolve. They didn't knock. They didn't shout. They simply waited. It was a classic Mark Harrison tactic, the psychological siege. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted me to look at that heavy vehicle and see the weight of his new life, the Jenkins family's power, the corporate backing, the sheer, crushing momentum of a man who had decided I no longer existed. I realized then that my suspicion had been too small. I had been thinking like a wife, worrying about affairs and hidden bank accounts. But as I watched those men, I realized I needed to start thinking like an enemy. If Mark was willing to send security to my door just because I threatened to attend a wedding, then the wedding wasn't just a party. It was a crime scene. I moved away from the window and went to the kitchen. My hands were shaking, so I gripped the edge of the marble counter until the stone bit into my palms. Focus, Tina, I whispered to the empty room. Provenance. Research. Patterns. I went back to the old journals I'd salvaged from the basement. These weren't my diaries, they were Mark's old planners from the early days of our marriage, before he became too paranoid to leave a paper trail. I flipped through the pages, looking for the name Marcus had mentioned, Arthur Vance. I found him in a 2005 entry. A lunch at a steakhouse in Chicago. A note in the margin, Vance says the foundation is everything. If the dirt is rotten, the building won't stand. Hide the dirt. Vance had been Mark's mentor in the dark arts of corporate restructuring. He was a man who specialized in making debt disappear into thin air. He had been disgraced in a massive hedge fund scandal a decade ago and had effectively vanished. And now, he was the guest of honor at Mark's wedding to the real estate heiress. Why? It hit me with the force of a physical blow. Mark wasn't just marrying Sarah for her money. He was using the Jenkins family's massive real estate holdings to wash the debts from his Irvine project. And Arthur Vance was the architect. The betrayal wasn't just that he cheated on me. The betrayal was that he had used our marriage as a placeholder, a respectable front, while he set up the biggest fraud of his career. I had been the clean wife, the one who hosted the charities and gave him a veneer of domestic stability, while he prepared to jump ship into a life of billionaire-level crime. I spent the next 4 hours digging through the public records of the Jenkins family. Sarah was the golden girl, yes, but her father, Silas Jenkins, was a man who didn't tolerate weakness. Silas was old school. If he found out that his future son-in-law was a fraud who was using his daughter as a human shield against a federal investigation, he wouldn't just cancel the wedding. He would bury Mark under the very concrete his family sold. That was my leverage. But it was also my death warrant. The men in the SUV finally left at dusk. I watched their taillights fade into the California twilight. They hadn't done anything, but the message was clear: we know where you are. We are watching. I knew I couldn't stay in the house. I grabbed a small bag, just the essentials, and my laptop. I left my phone on the kitchen counter. If they were tracking the GPS, they could watch my phone sit in the Malibu hills all night. I took the old beat-up car we used for errands, the one Mark never bothered to put a tracker on because he found it embarrassing. I drove to a motel in a part of town where the neon signs had missing letters and the air smelled like diesel and salt. I checked in under my maiden name. I sat on the edge of the sagging bed, the blue light of the laptop my only companion. I was looking at photos of Sarah. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to see a villain. But as I scrolled through her Instagram, the filtered photos of sonograms, the bride-to-be brunches, the glowing smiles, I saw something else. I saw a victim. Sarah was 26. She was naive. She thought she had found a powerful, brilliant man who worshipped her. She didn't know that Mark looked at her and saw a balance sheet. She didn't know that her baby was, to him, just another layer of optical stability. I felt a sudden, sickening pang of empathy. I remembered being 26. I remembered the way Mark looked at me when he proposed. He had that same worshipful gaze. It was a mask. It had always been a mask. But then, I saw a photo posted only an hour ago. It was Sarah and Mark at a final dress fitting. Sarah was in her gown, a cloud of white lace. And standing in the background, partially obscured by a curtain, was a man. He was older, with silver hair and eyes that looked like cold marbles. Arthur Vance. He wasn't just a guest. He was there, at the fitting. He was part of the inner circle. He was guiding the merger. My suspicion solidified into a plan. I didn't want to just show up at the wedding and cause a scene. That would be pathetic. I wanted to be the guest that Mark couldn't ignore. I wanted to be the person who whispered the truth into the ear of the only man Mark was truly afraid of, Silas Jenkins. I reached out to David. You remember David? Mark's friend from the gala, the one who liked to talk. David was a weak man, and weak men are the most useful tools when you know what they fear. I called him from a burner phone. David, I said, my voice as sharp as a razor. I'm looking at the Irvine audit. The one Mark tried to hide in the Project X folder. There was a frantic shuffling on the other end. Tina? What are you talking about? I don't know anything about an audit. Don't lie to me, David. You're the one who signed off on the travel expenses for Arthur Vance. If the feds come knocking, Mark will throw you under the bus before the ink on his marriage certificate is dry. He's already set you up as the fall guy. He wouldn't do that, David stammered. But the seed was planted. I could hear the sweat in his voice. He already has, I lied. But I can help you. I'm going to the wedding. I need to know one thing, what is this 7-word warning? David was silent for a long time. Then, in a whisper so quiet I could barely hear it over the motel's humming refrigerator, he said, "It's not a warning, Tina. It's a code. If someone says it to Mark, it means the offshore accounts have been flagged. It means it's time to run." "What are the words, David?" "The fog is heavy in San Francisco." The words felt like a death sentence. San Francisco. That's where we met. That's where he started his first firm. He had turned our most beautiful memory into a signal for a financial exit strategy. I hung up the phone. My heart was racing. I had the code. I had the motive. And I had the guest list. But there was one more thing. I went back to the photo of Sarah in her wedding dress. I zoomed in on the background, past Arthur Vance. There, on a small table near the mirror, was a medical folder. It was from the West Coast Fertility Center. My stomach turned. Sarah was pregnant, yes. But Mark had told me, 3 years ago, when we were still trying, that he was sterile. He had sat in our bedroom and cried, telling me he was heartbroken that he couldn't give me a child. I had spent years grieving that loss, accepting that it would just be the two of us. If he was sterile then, how was Sarah pregnant now? Either Mark had lied to me for years to avoid having a family with me, or the child wasn't his. And if the child wasn't his, Silas Jenkins was about to marry his daughter to a man who was not only a fraud but a cuckold. The suspicion was deepening into something much darker than financial crime. This was a biological betrayal. A soul-deep deception. I looked at my reflection in the motel's cracked mirror. My face was pale, my eyes shadowed. I didn't look like a curator. I looked like a ghost who had finally found the secret to coming back to life. The wedding was in 48 hours. Mark thought he was securing his future. He thought he was locking the door on his past. But I was already in the room. To destroy a man like Mark, you cannot be a person. A person has a heart that can be squeezed. A person has memories that can be used as leverage. To do what I needed to do, I had to become a sequence of events. I had to become the very thing Mark feared most, an unalterable truth. I spent the first 6 hours of that morning in a windowless room in a motel that didn't ask for ID. The air was thick with the smell of old cigarettes and industrial-grade bleach. I sat at a vanity table with a flickering fluorescent light, looking at the tools I had gathered. A box of professional-grade hair dye, raven black. A pair of colored contact lenses, steel gray. And a vintage sewing kit. I wasn't just changing my appearance, I was shedding the skin of the woman Mark Harrison had spent 12 years molding. He liked me in pastels. He liked me with honey blonde highlights. He liked me soft. As the black dye bled into the sink, swirling down the drain like oil, I felt the last of his influence washing away. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize myself. The woman staring back had eyes like winter flint. She looked like someone who had survived a shipwreck and decided the ocean owed her a debt. This was the woman who would attend the wedding. Not as an ex-wife, but as the inevitable consequence of his own greed. Spent the afternoon altering the navy dress I'd chosen. It was a piece of high-fashion armor, structured and severe. I ripped out the soft silk lining and replaced it with hidden pockets. In one, the burner phone. In another, a digital recorder no larger than a stick of gum. In the third, the most important piece of evidence, a copy of the fertility clinic records I'd managed to secure through a friend who owed me more than money. Provenance. It all comes back to provenance. In the art world, if you can't prove where a painting came from, it's worthless. In Mark's new world, the provenance of Sarah's pregnancy was the only thing that mattered. If that child wasn't his, or if he had lied about his sterility, the entire merger with the Jenkins family was built on a fraudulent contract. I thought about Sarah. I thought about the weight of that cream-colored lace on her shoulders. Was she in on it? Was she a co-conspirator, or just another asset being traded in the dark? I remembered a night, 2 years ago, when Mark and I were still trying. I had been crying in the bathroom after another negative test. He had come in, knelt beside me, and held me with such ferocity I thought he would break my ribs. "It's okay, Tina," he had whispered. "We don't need anyone else. Just us. We are enough." He had looked me in the eye while saying that, knowing that he had already had a vasectomy, or that he was lying about the results. He had watched me undergo painful hormone injections, watched me mourn every month, all while he played the part of the grieving, supportive husband. That wasn't just betrayal. That was psychological torture. He had let me hollow myself out for a dream he had already killed. As I stitched the final seam of my dress, I realized that I didn't want him to just lose his money. I wanted him to feel the exact moment the ground vanished beneath his feet. I wanted him to look at his new bride and see the ghost of the woman he had tortured standing right behind her. I drove to the venue under the cover of the storm. The wedding was being held at the Glass Cathedral, a private estate in the Santa Monica Mountains. It was a fortress of wealth. Security was tight, guards in black suits with earpieces, scanners at the gates, a guest list that required a QR code and a photo ID. Mark knew I was coming. He expected me to try to barge through the front gate, to make a scene, to scream his name. He had prepared for a melodrama. But he didn't know I knew about the service entrance. 2 years ago, I had curated a private collection for the owner of this estate. I knew that the catering staff entered through a hidden road on the north side of the ridge. I knew that at 6 p.m., the shift change was chaotic. I parked my car a mile away and walked through the scrub brush, the rain soaking through my coat. My boots sank into the California mud, but I didn't care. I felt electric. Every nerve ending was firing. I found the service gate. It was propped open by a crate of San Pellegrino. I slipped inside, moving through the labyrinth of the industrial kitchens. The smell of roasting lamb and expensive truffles was suffocating. I kept my head down, my black hair shielding my face. I found a staff changing room. I waited in a stall until it was empty, then I shed my wet coat and stepped into the navy dress. I put on the gray contacts. I applied a deep, blood-red lipstick. I walked out of the service area and into the main hall. The transformation was complete. I walked past a mirror and for a second, I didn't even see Tina. I saw a shadow. I saw the unbroken thread. The glass cathedral was breathtaking. The walls were nothing but giant panes of reinforced glass, revealing the jagged cliffs and the roiling gray ocean below. It felt like being inside a diamond. I moved through the crowd, a ghost among the living. I saw the board members. I saw the Jenkins cousins in their tailored tuxedos. Everyone was glowing. The air was thick with the scent of success. And then, I saw him. Mark was standing near the altar, talking to Silas Jenkins. Mark looked magnificent. His suit was bespoke, a deep charcoal that made his eyes pop. He was laughing, his hand resting familiarly on Silas's shoulder. He looked like a man who had finally ascended to his throne. I stood by a pillar, shielded by a massive floral arrangement of white orchids. I watched him. I watched the way he scanned the room every few seconds. He was looking for me. He was looking for the blonde woman in the pastel dress. He was looking for his victim. His eyes passed right over me. Twice. He didn't see me. To him, I was just another wealthy guest, another face in the sea of his triumph. I felt a surge of cold, dark joy. For the first time in my life, I had the advantage. I was the observer. I was the one with the provenance. I saw Arthur Vance step out from the shadows behind the altar. He whispered something into Mark's ear. Mark's laugh died instantly. He nodded, his face turning serious, his eyes darting to the door. Vance was nervous. The architect was smelling smoke. I began my approach. Not toward Mark. Toward Silas Jenkins. Silas was standing alone for a moment, sipping a scotch that probably cost more than my motel room. He was a formidable man, jaws made of granite, eyes that had seen every trick in the book. He didn't look like a happy father of the bride. He looked like a man performing a transaction. I stepped into his line of sight. "Mr. Jenkins," I said. My voice was different, lower, smoother. The gray eyes held his. He looked at me, his brow furrowing. "Do I know you, young lady?" "No," I said, a small, dangerous smile playing on my lips. "But you know my work. I'm a specialist in authenticity. And I think you've been sold a forgery." Silas didn't move. He didn't call security. A man like Silas knows that when a woman looks at you with eyes like winter flint, you listen. "What kind of forgery?" he asked, his voice a low growl. I leaned in close, the scent of his expensive tobacco filling my lungs. "Check the provenance of the Irvine project, Silas. And then, ask Mark why he's so afraid of the fog in San Francisco." Silas froze. The hand holding his scotch tightened until the glass groaned. He looked over my shoulder at Mark, then back at me. "Who are you?" "I'm the one who didn't burn," I whispered. I turned and walked away before he could respond. I disappeared back into the crowd, my heart thundering in my ears. The fuse was lit. I found a spot near the back of the room, near the giant glass doors that led to the balcony. I watched Silas. He didn't go back to Mark. He set his drink down on a passing waiter's tray and signaled to one of his own security men. He pointed toward Mark. The transaction was being audited. But then, the music changed. A triumphant blast of trumpets. The double doors at the back of the hall swung open. Sarah appeared. She was a vision in white lace, her veil trailing behind her like a fallen cloud. She looked radiant, innocent, and utterly doomed. She began her walk down the aisle, her eyes locked on Mark. Mark turned to face her, his face lit with a smile of pure, calculated victory. But as Sarah passed the pillar where I was standing, I stepped forward just an inch. Just enough for the light to hit my face. Just enough for the gray eyes to meet hers. Sarah stopped. The music continued, but the bride froze in the middle of the aisle. The guests began to murmur. Mark's smile faltered. Sarah looked at me, her face turning as white as her dress. She didn't know who I was, not with the black hair and the gray eyes, but she felt the ghost. She felt the truth. And then, from the back of the room, a guest I hadn't seen, a woman in a nurse's uniform who had somehow bypassed security, spoke up. It wasn't a scream. It was a clear, ringing statement that cut through the quartet like a knife. Mark Harrison. You shouldn't be marrying that girl until you tell her whose baby she's actually carrying. The room went silent. Mark turned pale, not just white, but the gray of a dead man. The 7-word warning had been bypassed. The truth hadn't whispered. It had roared. Silence in a room of 300 people is heavy. It has a physical weight, a density that makes it hard to draw a full breath. I stood perfectly still, my hand resting on the cold marble of the pillar. I watched Mark. I watched the blood drain from his lips, leaving them a bruised, sickly purple. He looked like a man who had been shot and hadn't yet realized the bullet had exited his back. The woman who had spoken, the nurse, was standing near the entrance. She wasn't a ghost, and she wasn't part of my plan. She was a wild card, a ghost from a different grave. I recognized her now. She had been the lead administrator at the clinic 3 years ago. She had been there when Mark told me the embryos were gone. Sarah was trembling so violently that the lace on her sleeves looked like it was fluttering in a breeze. She looked at Mark, then at the nurse, then back at Mark. Mark, she whispered. It was a small sound, the sound of a child realizing the hand they're holding doesn't belong to their father. Mark didn't look at her. He was looking at Silas Jenkins. Silas didn't wait for an explanation. He didn't ask the nurse to sit down. He walked into the center of the aisle, his presence dwarfing everyone in the room. He looked at Mark with the detached curiosity of a man looking at a bug he's about to crush. Mark, Silas said. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled every corner of the glass cathedral. The lady asked a question. And interestingly enough, I was just told by a specialist that your provenance is a bit questionable. Now, I'm a man who values a sound investment. I don't like being sold a forgery. Mark tried to speak. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. He looked at Arthur Vance, seeking a lifeline. But Vance was already moving. I saw him slipping toward the side exit, his silver hair a streak of light in the shadows. The architect was abandoning the building before the roof fell in. Silas, please, Mark finally gasped, his voice cracking. This is a misunderstanding. This woman, she's disgruntled. She's looking for a payout. And Tina is here somewhere, she's obsessed, she's trying to ruin this. I don't care about Tina, Silas barked, cutting him off like a blunt instrument. I care about the truth. Is that child a Jenkins? Or is it a liability? I stepped out from behind the pillar. I didn't rush. I didn't scream. I walked toward the altar with the slow, measured pace of a priestess approaching an offering. The crowd parted for me. They didn't know who I was with the black hair and the gray eyes, but they felt the gravity of my movement. I reached the center of the aisle and looked at Mark. Up close, the victory he had worn 10 minutes ago was nothing but a smear of sweat and terror. The child isn't a Jenkins, Silas, I said. My voice was calm, echoing off the glass walls. And it isn't a liability. It's a miracle. One that Mark stole. Mark's eyes went wide. He finally recognized me. The gray eyes couldn't hide the soul he had spent a decade trying to diminish. Tina, he hissed, a spray of saliva hitting the air. What have you done? I handed the folder to Silas. Not to Mark. Mark no longer had any standing in this room. Those are the records from the West Coast Fertility Center, Silas. Look at the dates. Look at the serial numbers of the embryos. Mark told me they were destroyed in a power failure 3 years ago. He even showed me a falsified insurance claim. I turned to Sarah. She was looking at me with eyes full of horror. Sarah, I said, my voice softening just a fraction. He didn't choose you because he loved you. He chose you because you were young, healthy, and your father had the capital to cover his tracks. He used my biological material, the embryos we created, to ensure he had a biological heir that would keep you tied to him forever. You aren't carrying his new beginning. You're carrying my stolen dream. The gasp that went through the room was like a collective intake of air before a scream. Sarah collapsed. She didn't just sit, she went to her knees, her white gown spreading out on the floor like spilled milk. She clutched her stomach, her face contorted in a silent wail. Mark lunged for the folder in Silas's hand, but Silas's security team was faster. They grabbed Mark by the arms, pinning him back. Mark struggled, his face turning a dark, vengeful red. You're lying. She's crazy. She's a scorned woman. A scorned woman is a cliché, Mark, I said, stepping closer until I could smell the terror on his skin. I'm a curator. And I've just exposed the biggest forgery of your life. Silas read the documents. He was a man who understood contracts, and he was looking at the ultimate breach. He looked at the nurse, who nodded solemnly. He looked at the records. Then, he looked at Mark. It was the look of a god deciding to revoke a soul. Arthur Vance is already halfway to the airport, Mark, Silas said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly low register. And my people are already at your Irvine office. Did you really think you could build a house of cards on my land? Silas turned to his head of security. Get him out of here. Take him to the holding room. We'll wait for the authorities. And call the clinic's legal board. I want to know exactly how much it costs to buy a nurse and a doctor. The security team began to drag Mark away. He wasn't a powerful executive anymore. He was a screaming, frantic mess, kicking at the floor, his charcoal suit bunching up around his neck. Tina! You'll pay for this. I gave you everything, he shrieked as they dragged him through the double doors. I stood in the center of the aisle and watched him go. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I felt a profound sense of alignment. The world had tilted back onto its axis. I looked down at Sarah. She was still on the floor, surrounded by her bridesmaids who were fluttering around her like panicked birds. She looked up at me, her eyes streaming with tears. Is it true? She whispered. Is it really yours? I knelt down beside her. I didn't touch her. The biology is mine, Sarah. But the choice is yours. He lied to both of us. He used us both as containers for his ego. Sarah looked at her stomach, then at the empty altar where the man she thought she loved had just been unmasked as a monster. She didn't say anything. She just closed her eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. I stood up and looked around the room. The elite of California were staring at me. The board members, the socialites, the rivals, they were all witnesses. The porcelain mask of Mark Harrison hadn't just cracked, it had been pulverized. I walked toward the exit. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The fire was already burning, and I had been the one to strike the match. As I reached the glass doors, Silas Jenkins stepped into my path. He looked at me for a long time, his eyes unreadable. You've cost me a lot of money tonight, Tina, he said. I saved you a fortune, Silas, I replied. You are about to merge your legacy with a parasite. Silas nodded slowly. Maybe. But parasites are hard to kill. Mark still has the offshore accounts. He still has the codes. He's going to fight. This isn't over. I know, I said, stepping past him into the cold, rainy night. But for the first time in 12 years, I'm the one holding the keys. I got into my car and drove away from the glass cathedral. Behind me, the lights of the estate flickered and died. The major betrayal was revealed. But the fallout was going to be a nuclear winter. When the adrenaline leaves your body, it doesn't leave you empty. It leaves you bruised. I sat on the floor of my half-empty living room, the navy silk of my dress bunched around my knees. The raven black dye was still staining the edges of my forehead, a mark of the woman I had become to survive the night. I had won. That's what the world would say. I had unmasked the villain, saved the heiress, and exposed the fraud. But as I stared at the moon reflected in the glass walls of the house Mark built, I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like a demolition expert standing in the center of a city I had just leveled. Everything was gone. The 12 years of memories I had tried to curate, the anniversary trips, the quiet mornings, the shared dreams, were now tainted. They weren't just over, they were retroactively poisoned. Every "I love you" Mark had whispered was now a calculated line of dialogue in a long-con performance. The hardest part of a betrayal isn't the lie itself. It's the realization that you were the only one playing the game for real. I had been a wife, he had been an actor. I had been building a home, he had been building an exit strategy. I didn't want to answer the world. But the world was screaming. My burner phone, the one I'd used to coordinate with David, was glowing like a coal in the dark. I picked it up. Dozens of messages. News alerts. The wedding of the year had become the scandal of the decade. Photos of Mark being led away in handcuffs were already trending. The headlines were savage: Harrison's House of Cards, the biothief of Beverly Hills. Then, a text from an unknown number: she's at the Cedar Hills clinic. She won't talk to anyone but you. Sarah. I didn't want to see her. I wanted to stay in my hollowed-out house and mourn the woman I used to be. But the thought of that child, the biological echo of a dream I thought had died 3 years ago, pulled at me like a physical cord. I changed out of the navy dress and into a simple gray sweater. I looked at the black hair in the mirror. I decided to keep it. The blonde Tina was gone. She was the one who got fooled. The woman with the raven hair was the one who survived. Cedar Hills was a private facility, the kind where the wealthy go to hide their breakdowns and their births. Silas Jenkins had draped the place in security. I was met at the door by 2 men who looked like they were made of granite. They didn't ask for ID. They simply moved aside. Silas had given the order. I found Sarah in a room filled with white lilies. The scent was cloying, like a funeral. She was sitting by the window, her face pale and translucent. She was no longer the glowing bride. She looked like a ghost in a hospital gown. "You came," she said. Her voice was thin, like paper. "I came for the truth, Sarah," I said, sitting in the chair across from her. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't have any left to give. Sarah looked at her hands. "He told me you were unstable. He told me you'd had a breakdown after the fertility treatments failed and that you'd become obsessed with the idea of a child. He said he saved the embryos to protect them from you. That he wanted to give them a healthy mother." I felt the rage simmer beneath my skin, but I kept my voice flat. "He didn't save them to protect them, Sarah. He saved them because they were the only part of his legacy he actually controlled. He knew Silas would only back him if there was a grandson in the picture. He used me for the genes, and you for the delivery system." Sarah let out a jagged, broken laugh. "We're just vessels to him, aren't we? Containers for his ambition." "Yes," I said. "But the container is broken now. What are you going to do?" Sarah looked at me with a sudden, fierce intensity. "My father wants me to terminate. He says a child born of this theft is a legal nightmare. He says it's better to start over. To erase Mark Harrison completely." My heart stopped. The child, my child, was being discussed like a line item in a budget. "Is that what you want?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what I want," she cried, her composure finally shattering. "I thought I was a mother. I thought I was loved. And now I find out I'm just a surrogate for a woman I don't even know, in a marriage that was a crime." I stood up and walked to the window. I looked out at the lights of Los Angeles, a sea of diamonds on a velvet cloth. "I spent 3 years grieving a child I thought never existed," I said, not looking at her. "I mourned every month. I walked past nurseries and had to hold my breath so I wouldn't cry. You have the choice I never had. You have the life inside you. But you should know, if you carry this child, Mark will never stop. Even from prison, he will try to use this child to get back to you. To get back to the Jenkins money." Sarah was silent for a long time. Then, she spoke with a coldness that surprised me. "Not if he doesn't have a leg to stand on. My father is already stripping his assets. Mark will have nothing but the clothes on his back when the feds are done." Silas didn't look at his daughter. He looked at me. "The feds are at the Irvine office," he said. "They found the Project X files. Mark was more than just a fraud, Tina. He was selling proprietary data to foreign firms. He was a traitor to his own partners." I felt a chill. This was bigger than I had imagined. Mark wasn't just a bio-thief, he was a corporate spy. He had been playing a game with stakes that went far beyond California real estate. "What happens to him?" I asked. He goes away for a long time, Silas said, his eyes hard as flint. But he's already talking. He's trying to cut a deal. He's claiming you were his accomplice. He says you were the one who suggested using the embryos as a way to secure the Jenkins merger. I didn't flinch. I had expected this. Mark's final move would be to drag me down with him. If he couldn't have his throne, he would ensure I stayed in the grave he'd dug for me. He has no proof, Silas, I said. He doesn't need proof to start an investigation, Silas replied. And an investigation will ruin your gallery. It will ruin your reputation. You'll be the biothief's accomplice in every paper in the country. I looked at Silas. I looked at Sarah. I realized that the fallout wasn't just about Mark's destruction. It was about my survival. I had unmasked the monster, but the monster was now trying to swallow me whole from inside his cage. What do you want, Silas? I asked. Silas stepped closer, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. I want this to go away. All of it. The child, the scandal, the connection to my family. I want you to sign a document stating the embryos were donated voluntarily. In exchange, I'll make sure the feds lose interest in your involvement. I'll protect your gallery. I'll give you back your life. I looked at Sarah. She was watching me, her hand resting on her stomach. The child. My child. If I signed, I would be safe. My career would be saved. But the child would be erased. My biological legacy would be signed away to Silas Jenkins to be managed. I stood at the crossroads of my own making. I had spent months planning revenge. But now, I had to plan a future. Give me the pen, I said. If you think you know what I did next, you haven't been listening. Revenge is a fire, but power? Power is what you do when the fire goes out. Silas Jenkins didn't become a billionaire by believing in the goodness of others. He became a billionaire by understanding that everyone has a price, and most people are desperate for a bargain. As he pushed that silver-plated pen toward me in the sterile light of the clinic, he thought he was buying my silence. He thought he was buying my child's non-existence. I looked at the document. It was a masterpiece of legal obfuscation. Voluntary donation. Release of all biological claims. Non-disclosure agreement in perpetuity. If I signed this, the child Sarah was carrying would legally become a Jenkins asset, and then, quietly, that asset would be liquidated. I picked up the pen. Silas leaned back, a small, triumphant glint in his eyes. He already saw me as a problem solved. But Silas had made the same mistake Mark had. He saw me as a woman who wanted her life back. He didn't realize that the life he was offering back was a cage. I didn't want my old life. I wanted a new world, one where I didn't have to ask men like him for permission to exist. I didn't sign. I held the pen over the paper just long enough for Silas to get comfortable, and then I dropped it. It rolled across the mahogany table, leaving a thin, black streak of ink, a scar on his perfect plan. The price is too low, Silas, I said. Silas's face didn't change, but the air in the room grew cold. I'm offering you your reputation, Tina. I'm offering you immunity from a federal investigation into your husband's treason. Most people would call that a gift. I'm not most people, I replied, standing up. And Mark wasn't my husband when he stole those embryos. He was a stranger. You want me to sign away my biology so you can protect your brand. But you've forgotten one thing about brands, Silas. They're only valuable if the public trusts them. I looked over at Sarah, who was watching us like a spectator at her own execution. I'm not signing. Not yet. I need 48 hours. I walked out of the clinic before he could threaten me. I knew the security guards were watching, and I knew Silas would have me followed. But I had spent the last decade living with a man who specialized in surveillance. I knew how to disappear in plain sight. I didn't go back to Malibu. I went to the one place Mark would never look, his own secret Project X archive. You see, Mark was a man of immense ego, but he was also a man of immense fear. He kept backups of everything. He didn't trust the cloud, he trusted physical servers. He had a small, climate-controlled storage unit in a nondescript facility in Van Nuys, rented under the name of a defunct shell company we'd started for a gallery project years ago. I had the key. I'd found it in the glove compartment of the car I'd taken, hidden inside an old, hollowed-out owner's manual. The storage unit was cold and smelled of ozone. I sat on a plastic crate, my laptop connected to a stack of external drives. I wasn't looking for the embezzlement files, the feds already had those. I was looking for the insurance policy. Mark always said, if you're going to bed with a shark, make sure you know where the shark sleeps. He had been in bed with Silas Jenkins for 3 years. He wouldn't have gone into that merger without leverage. I dug through folders of encrypted data. Hours bled into each other. My eyes burned. And then, at 4 a.m., I found it. A folder labeled, Jenkins, Acquisitions, 2022. It wasn't a list of buildings. It was a list of payoffs. Silas Jenkins hadn't just built his empire, he'd bribed the city council, the environmental boards, and the zoning commissions for every major development in the valley for the last decade. And Mark had documented every single wire transfer. This was the secret discovery. Mark hadn't just been bio-thieving and embezzling. He had been building a blackmail file on his own father-in-law. This was why Silas was so desperate to erase the connection. He wasn't afraid of the scandal of a stolen baby, he was afraid that Mark's downfall would lead the feds directly to the rot at the heart of the Jenkins empire. I sat there in the dark, the blue light of the screen illuminating the raven hair I'd dyed to hide from my past. I realized that I held the detonator to the entire California elite. I could take down Silas. I could destroy the Jenkins family. But if I did, what would happen to the child? If the Jenkins empire fell, Sarah would be penniless. The child, my biological son, would be born into a whirlwind of litigation and poverty. He would be the scandal baby for the rest of his life. I had to decide what kind of revenge I wanted. Did I want to burn the world down, or did I want to build a fortress for the only thing that mattered? I started copying the files. Not to the feds. Not to the press. To a private, encrypted server I'd set up months ago when I first started my gallery. My insurance policy. I called Arthur Vance. Yes, the architect. The man Silas said was halfway to the airport. I knew Arthur. He was a rat, but he was a rat who knew how to navigate the sewers. Arthur, I said when he finally picked up. He sounded breathless, terrified. The feds are at the airport. Silas leaked your tail number. He's making you the scapegoat for the Project X foreign data sales. There was a long, jagged silence. That bastard, Arthur hissed. I built his foundations. I can help you, Arthur. I have the Jenkins bribe files. The real ones. The ones Mark kept in Van Nuys. What do you want, Tina? I want the name of the doctor at the Cedar Hills Clinic. Not the one on the charts. The one Silas pays to make problems go away. I know Sarah is scheduled for a procedure tomorrow morning. I want that doctor stopped. Arthur gave me the name. Dr. Eris Thorne. A man who specialized in the discreet needs of the ultra-wealthy. I had 48 hours. Now, I had 12. I drove through the night, a silent predator in the California rain. I wasn't the victim anymore. I wasn't even the curator. I was the one who knew where the shark slept. I wasn't going to the clinic. I was going to Silas Jenkins's private estate. I was going to show him my insurance policy. But as I pulled onto the winding road leading to the Jenkins fortress, a pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. High beams. Blinding. They weren't stopping. They were accelerating. Someone didn't want me to reach the gate. Someone knew what was on that drive. Was it Silas? Or was it Mark, working from the inside of a holding cell? I gripped the wheel, the gray eyes staring back at me from the mirror, cold and unafraid. Come on then, I whispered. Let's see who burns first. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed, you're just like the people in the other cars, watching the wreck without helping. Subscribe now, or admit you're just here for the carnage. And for those who think Tina should release the bribe files now? Tell us in the comments. Would you destroy an empire to save a soul? Fear is a luxury I discarded back at the motel. When you've already seen the person you love most turn into a stranger, a pair of headlights in the dark doesn't feel like a threat, it feels like a challenge. The black SUV behind me was closing the gap. They weren't trying to pull me over. They were trying to pit maneuver me off the side of a Malibu Canyon road. I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. 5:14 a.m. In less than 4 hours, Dr. Eris Thorne would arrive at the Cedar Hills Clinic. In less than 4 hours, Silas Jenkins would attempt to clean up the mess Mark Harrison had left behind. I didn't have time for a high-speed chase. I needed to execute the first part of my counterplay. I needed Silas to understand that I wasn't just a witness, I was the executioner of his reputation. They hit me. The impact sent a jolt through my spine, my teeth rattling in my skull. They thought I was a scared woman trying to flee. They didn't realize I was leading them to a specific spot. 3 miles ahead was the Devil's Elbow, a sharp U-turn where the road narrowed between a rock face and a sheer drop-off. I knew this road. I had driven it 1,000 times with Mark, back when we used to go to the private beach clubs in the early days of our marriage. Mark used to brag about how he could take the turn at 60. I was going 75. I reached into my bag and pulled out the burner phone. I didn't dial Silas. I dialed the head of the security team that had dragged Mark out of the wedding. A man named Elias. Elias, I shouted over the wind. Your men are about to push me off a cliff. If this car goes over, the Jenkins acquisitions folder goes live on a public server in 60 seconds. Tell Silas that the bribe to Councilman Miller for the 2022 rezoning is the first thing the DA will see. There was a burst of static, then a deep, muffled voice. Back off, Elias commanded. In my rearview mirror, the SUV braked so hard the front end dived. The headlights swept across the canyon wall as they slowed to a crawl. They had been told to kill the problem, but they hadn't been told the problem was holding a thermal detonator. I stepped out of the car. My legs felt like lead, but my mind was a diamond. I walked to the edge of the turnout, the raven hair plastered to my cheeks. The black SUV stopped 50 yards away. They didn't get out. They were waiting for orders. I pulled up my laptop and opened the insurance policy. I wasn't bluffing. I had already programmed the dead man's switch. If I didn't enter a code every hour, the contents of the Van Nuys storage unit would be sent to the Los Angeles Times, the FBI, and the SEC. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then, a black sedan, not an SUV, pulled up. Silas Jenkins stepped out. He didn't have an umbrella. He didn't have his coat. He looked like a man who had been woken up by a nightmare. He walked toward me, the mist swirling around his expensive shoes. You're smarter than Mark, Silas said, his voice barely audible over the wind. Mark was a shark, but he was a loud one. You're a current. You don't make a sound until the ship is already sinking. The ship is already underwater, Silas, I said. I'm just deciding who gets the lifeboats. What do you want? Silas asked. Money? I can give you more than you'll ever make in that gallery. I can give you the Malibu house, the Irvine office, 10 million in a Swiss account. Just hand over the drive and the passwords. I let out a short, cold laugh. You still think this is about a transaction? You think you can buy your way out of biology? I stepped closer to him, the gray eyes boring into his. I don't want your money, Silas. I want the procedure at Cedar Hills cancelled. Now. I want a legal document, signed by you and Sarah, acknowledging my biological maternity and granting me full custodial rights the moment that child is born. Silas stared at me. The cigar smoke trailed off into the mist. You're asking for the Jenkins heir. You're asking me to hand over the only thing that gives my daughter a future. No, I corrected. I'm asking you to hand over the only thing that keeps you out of a federal penitentiary. The child is mine. Sarah is the surrogate. That is the new provenance. Sign it, or I hit enter. Silas was a predator, and a predator knows when it's trapped. He looked at the tablet, where the first page of the acquisitions folder was displayed. He saw his own signature on a bribe for the Valley Mall project. He looked at me. For the first time, I saw respect in his eyes. It was a cold, ugly kind of respect, the kind one monster gives another. Elias, Silas said, not looking away from me. Call Dr. Thorne. Tell him the patient changed her mind. The pregnancy continues under the protection of the Jenkins family, but the final destination is different. This was the first turning point. The minor execution. I had executed Silas's control. I had executed his plan to erase my child. I watched as the phone call was made. I heard the orders given. But I wasn't finished. One more thing, Silas, I said. Mark. I want him moved. He's in a county holding cell. I want him in a high-security federal facility where he can't talk to Sarah. And I want the 7-word code changed. He thinks he can still use it to trigger an exit. I want that exit blocked. Silas smiled then. It was a terrifying sight. Consider it done. Mark Harrison is about to find out that the fog in San Francisco has turned into a blizzard. I stood there as the silence returned. I had the documents. I had the confession. I had saved the child. But as I looked down at the tablet in my hand, I saw a new notification. It wasn't from the insurance policy. It was a message from an encrypted app Mark used. It was a photo. It was a photo of me, standing in this exact turnout, taken from the woods behind me. And beneath it, a single sentence: "The architect always leaves a back door, Tina." I'm already out. Mark wasn't in the cell. He hadn't been dragged away to prison. He had used the confusion at the wedding to trigger his own disappearance. And now, the man who stole my life was hunting me in the mist. The photo on my screen was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Mark didn't just want me to know he was free, he wanted me to know that my victory was an illusion. In that grainy, long-lens shot of me standing on the cliffside, I looked like a target. The message was clear: I can see you. I can touch you. You are only alive because I haven't decided otherwise. I didn't panic. Panic is for people who still have something to lose. I got back into my car, my heart a steady, cold rhythm against my ribs. If Mark was out, he was running on limited resources. He had no bank accounts, no corporate backing, and the Jenkins family wanted him dead. He was a cornered animal, and a cornered animal always returns to its familiar hunting grounds. I drove straight to the one place Mark would assume was a safe house for me, the private gallery I had curated in the arts district. It was a fortress of concrete and steel, filled with motion sensors and silent alarms. I didn't go there to hide. I went there to set the trap. I sat in the center of the gallery, surrounded by the art of survivors. There was a piece by a woman who had escaped a war zone, a jagged sculpture of rusted rebar and broken glass. I looked at it and felt a kinship. We were both built from the wreckage. I called Silas Jenkins. "He's out," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "I know," Silas growled. I could hear the sound of voices in the background: lawyers, security, the frantic machinery of a billionaire trying to plug a leak. He bribed a transport guard. The man is a ghost. We've alerted the border, the airports, even the private strips. You won't find him at an airport, Silas. Mark doesn't run away. He restructures. He's going to try to take back the leverage. He's going to come for the Van Nuys drive, and then he's going to come for me. What do you want me to do? Silas asked. There was a new note in his voice: deference. He realized that I was the only one who truly understood how Mark's mind worked. I want you to leak a rumor, I said, my voice steady. Tell the associates, the fixers, the people Mark trusts, that the Van Nuys drive is being moved to the gallery tonight for digital forensic analysis. Let him know the vault is vulnerable for exactly 2 hours. Strategy escalation. In the art world, you learn that the value of a piece isn't in what it is, but in what people think it is. I was turning myself into a masterpiece of bait. I spent the next 3 hours mapping out the gallery's blind spots. I wasn't using Silas's men for this. I couldn't trust them not to report back to Silas. I contacted a private security firm, one that specialized in high-value asset protection. They were mercenaries, essentially, but they were loyal to the wire transfer. I had them install a series of high-definition thermal cameras at every entrance. I wanted to see Mark before he saw me. I wanted to see the heat of his breath in the cold gallery air. As the sun began to set, turning the downtown skyline into a jagged silhouette of orange and black, I received a notification. Not from the security team. From the Cedar Hills Clinic. It was a video call. Sarah. She was still in her hospital bed, but the lilies were gone. She looked older, her face etched with a sudden, sharp maturity. He called me, she whispered. My blood turned to ice. When? 10 minutes ago. He didn't say where he was. He just told me he was coming for his property. He told me the baby and the files are his, and that if I didn't help him, he'd make sure my father spent the rest of his life in a cage. What did you tell him, Sarah? I told him to go to hell, she said, a flicker of the Jenkins steel appearing in her eyes. But Tina, he laughed. He said, hell is where the secrets are kept, Sarah. I'm just going to collect the keys. I closed my eyes. The keys. He wasn't talking about the storage unit. He was talking about me. He knew I was the only one who could access the encrypted dead man's switch. Stay in the clinic, Sarah. Do not leave the floor. Silas has men there. Trust them for now, but trust no one who doesn't have the code word I gave you. I hung up. The test was over. The enemy had engaged. Mark wasn't running for the border, he was doubling down. He was going to walk right into my parlor, and he was going to bring the darkness with him. 11 p.m. The gallery was dark, save for the emergency lights that cast long, distorted shadows across the sculptures. I sat in my glass-walled office, the laptop open in front of me. I looked like a woman working late, a woman unaware that she was being hunted. But under the desk, my hand was on the controls for the internal security shutters. I watched the thermal feed on a secondary tablet. The street outside was empty. A stray dog. A piece of wind-blown trash. And then, a bloom of heat. It wasn't at the front door. It wasn't at the service entrance. It was on the roof. Mark was an avid climber. In the early years, we'd spend weekends at Joshua Tree, scaling the boulders until our fingers were raw. I had forgotten that. I had forgotten that he didn't need a door to get into a building. I watched the heat signature move across the skylight. It was slow, deliberate. He was bypass cutting the glass. My heart was hammering, but my hands were cold. This was it. The strategy escalation was reaching its peak. I wasn't just testing him, I was inviting him to commit the act that would end him forever. He descended like a spider. I watched him on the monitor, a black-clad figure dropping from the ceiling into the center of the unbroken thread exhibit. He landed silently, his movements fluid and practiced. He didn't head for the vault. He headed for my office. I didn't move. I kept my back to the glass, typing a dummy sequence into the laptop. I could feel him. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with his presence. The scent of the rain-soaked linen of his jacket, the faint metallic tang of the tools he carried, it was like a ghost had finally manifested. "You always did like to play the martyr, Tina," a voice said from the shadows. I didn't turn around. "And you always did like to play the god, Mark. But gods don't hide in the rafters." I heard the click of a gun. Not a heavy one. A small, discreet 9mm, the kind he used to keep in the safe for emergencies. "Turn around." Slowly. I turned. Mark looked terrible. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot, but there was a manic energy behind them that was more dangerous than his calculated corporate persona. He held the gun with a steady hand, pointed directly at my chest. "The drive," he said. "And the password for the dead man's switch. Now. The drive is in the vault, Mark. But the password, that's in here." I tapped my temple. "And if you kill me, the Jenkins files hit the wire in 30 seconds. You'll be a dead man before you hit the street. You think I care about the files anymore?" Mark stepped into the light, and I saw that he was wearing a vest, a heavy, bulky garment beneath his jacket. "Silas destroyed my life. You destroyed my legacy. I'm not here for the money, Tina. I'm here to make sure no one wins." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small remote. "I didn't just come down the rope. I spent an hour on that roof with 10 pounds of C4. If I press this button, this gallery, the files, and the both of us become a footnote in tomorrow's paper." He wasn't looking for an exit. He was looking for an ending. I looked at the remote, then at the man I had loved for 12 years. I realized then that the testing the enemy phase was over. I wasn't fighting a man anymore. I was fighting a bomb. The air in the gallery felt ionized, like the moments before a lightning strike. Mark stood 5 feet away, his thumb hovering over the red button of the detonator. He looked like a man who had already died and was simply waiting for his body to catch up. The C4 he'd mentioned, the threat of the roof collapsing in a rain of glass and fire, didn't terrify me. What terrified me was the look in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had finally found his truth, that if he couldn't be the master of his world, he would be its ghost. "The files don't matter, Mark," I said, my voice barely a ripple in the stillness. "The money doesn't matter. You're holding that remote because you want me to look at you. You want me to see the power you think you still have." "I don't think I have it, Tina," he spat, his voice a jagged edge. "I am it. I built you. I built this city. I built that child in Sarah's womb. And I can unmake it all in a heartbeat." It was in that moment, as he ranted about his godhood, that I noticed the red light on the thermal monitor behind him. It wasn't a heat signature from a person. It was a transmission signal. A tiny, blue and red flicker coming from the collar of his own jacket. He wasn't just here to kill me. He was being tracked. But not by Silas. And not by the police. Mark flinched, his thumb jerking on the remote. "What was that?" "That's the sound of a back door closing, Mark," I said, though I didn't know what it meant yet. I was improvising, playing the only hand I had left. "You said the architect always leaves a way out. But you aren't the architect of this play. You're just the lead actor." Suddenly, the large digital display in the center of the gallery, usually reserved for high-definition art projections, flickered to life. It wasn't showing a sculpture. It was showing a live feed of a darkened room. A room I recognized. It was the back office of the fertility clinic. In the video, a figure was sitting at a desk, their face obscured by shadow. They were holding a file, the original, physical file from 3 years ago. Mark turned toward the screen, his face contorting. Who is that? Silas? Is that you, you old bastard? The figure in the video leaned forward into the light. It wasn't Silas Jenkins. It was David. David. Mark's weak friend. The man I thought I was using as a tool. The man who had given me the 7-word warning. He wasn't trembling in the video. He looked calm. He looked purposeful. Hello, Mark, David said, his voice echoing through the gallery's surround sound system. Hello, Tina. I thought it was time we ended the performance. Mark's hand was shaking now. David? You pathetic worm. You're supposed to be in Irvine, burning the ledgers. I did burn the ledgers, Mark, David said, a thin smile touching his lips. The ones you wanted me to burn. But I kept the ones that mattered. You see, Mark, you always treated me like a loyal dog. You forgot that even a dog gets tired of being kicked. You thought I was too stupid to understand the Project X foreign data sales. But I'm the one who set up the servers. I'm the one who invited the feds. And I'm the one who told Tina about the embryos. My breath caught. The midpoint twist. The whistleblower wasn't a disgruntled nurse. It wasn't a guest at the wedding who just happened to know the truth. It was David. He had been orchestrating this for years. He hadn't been helping me because he was afraid of me, he had been using me as the face of his own revenge. Why? Mark roared, stepping toward the screen, momentarily forgetting the detonator. I gave you everything. I made you a partner. You made me a scapegoat, David replied. You were going to let me go to prison for the embezzlement while you sailed off with the Jenkins family. But here's the revelation, Mark. The one even Tina doesn't know. David held up a document. It was a DNA profile. Not from the embryos. From Mark. 3 years ago, Mark, you didn't have a vasectomy, David said, his voice dropping to a cold, clinical tone. And you weren't sterile. You went to that clinic to deposit material, but you didn't want a child with Tina. You wanted a biological contingency you could use later. But the clinic didn't make a mistake. I did. Mark stopped. He looked like he had been turned to stone. I switched the samples, Mark, David continued. The embryos Tina thinks are hers? The child Sarah is carrying? They aren't yours, Mark. And they aren't Tina's. The world tilted. I felt the floor drop out from under me. What are you saying, David? I screamed at the screen. Whose are they? They belong to a donor, Tina. An anonymous donor I chose from the database. Mark has been fighting a war for a legacy that isn't his. And Tina, you've been risking your life for a dream that was replaced by a stranger's DNA years ago. The remote lay on the polished concrete between us. Mark didn't reach for it. He didn't care about the C4 anymore. He didn't care about me. The revelation had stripped him of the only thing he valued, his biological narcissism. He had built his entire criminal empire on the idea of his own bloodline, and David had turned it into a prank. Mark looked at his hands as if they didn't belong to him. Not mine, he whispered. None of it? The wedding, the merger, the child. All built on a lie I curated just for you, David said. I knew you'd eventually leave Tina. I knew you'd find a woman like Sarah. I just waited for you to commit enough crimes to make the fall worth it. I looked at Mark. The monster was gone. In his place was a hollowed-out shell of a man, destroyed not by justice, but by a better liar. I felt a strange, cold pity. We had both been pawns in David's long game. My grief, my revenge, my victory at the wedding, it was all scripted by a man who had been sitting in the shadows for a decade. The police are 3 minutes away, Mark, David said. And Silas Jenkins is with them. He doesn't care about the DNA. He just wants the man who tried to ruin his name. You're going to a place where legacy doesn't exist. The screen went black. Mark looked up at me. His eyes were empty. He reached for the remote on the floor, but he didn't pick it up to press it. He just held it, staring at the red button. 12 years, Tina, he said, his voice a ghost. We were the unbroken thread. That's what you called us. The thread was broken a long time ago, Mark, I said. We just didn't see the edges fraying. The testing the enemy phase was over. The midpoint twist had rewritten the rules of the game. I wasn't the mother of a stolen child. I wasn't the vengeful ex-wife. I was a woman who had been fighting for a hallucination. As the police swarmed the room, pinning Mark to the floor, I saw Silas Jenkins enter. He looked at me, then at the black-clad man screaming on the floor. Silas walked over to me, his face a mask of iron. The files, Tina. The drive. Give it to me, and we can forget this ever happened. I looked at Silas. Then I looked at the dark skylight. The files are gone, Silas, I said. And so am I. But I was lying. David hadn't told me everything. And I had one more secret of my own, one that even David didn't see coming. Watching Mark being dragged across the concrete floor should have felt like a victory. It should have been the moment the weight lifted from my chest. But as Silas Jenkins' security team stood guard and the police began their clinical sweep of the room, I didn't feel light. I felt sharp. David's revelation hadn't just shattered the lie of my motherhood, it had stripped away the last of my illusions about everyone in my life. I was standing in the center of the room, the raven hair messy, my navy dress torn at the shoulder, but I was the only one who truly saw the board. David thought he had won. He thought that by revealing the DNA swap, he had turned me into another one of his victims, a side character in his personal revenge against Mark. He was currently sitting in a safe room at the clinic, thinking he was the director of this tragedy. He forgot one thing. A curator doesn't just collect art, she determines its value. And I was about to make David's life completely worthless. Silas Jenkins approached me, his presence cutting through the chaos like a winter chill. He didn't look at Mark. To Silas, Mark was already a ghost, a bad investment written off the books. He looked only at me. The detonator was a fake, Tina, Silas said, his voice low. My bomb squad checked the roof. It was just boxes of clay and wires. Mark was bluffing. He never had the stomach for a suicide pact. He didn't need the stomach, Silas, I replied, not looking away from the door where they were loading Mark into a van. He just needed the theater. And you fell for it. Enough games, Silas hissed, stepping into my personal space. The drive. David told me you have the backup files. If you think you can use them as leverage now that the child isn't yours, you're mistaken. Without that biological link, you're just a witness with a stolen hard drive. I can have you arrested for industrial espionage before the sun comes up. I turned to face him, a slow smile spreading across my face. It was the smile of a woman who had already moved 3 steps ahead. You still don't get it, Silas. David didn't just lie to Mark. He lied to you. He told you he was cleaning up the files, but David has been a double agent for the Fed since the day Mark first approached you. He isn't your fixer. He's your executioner. And I'm the only one who can stop the clock on your indictment. Silas froze. The iron mask finally slipped, revealing the terror underneath. What are you talking about? David didn't swap the DNA to hurt Mark, I said, leaning in close. He swapped it so the Jenkins family wouldn't have a legal claim to the legacy. He wanted to isolate you. He's been feeding the SEC information for months, using Mark's ego as a shield. While you were focused on erasing me, David was erasing your entire empire. I pulled up my phone and showed him a screen he didn't expect. It was a live log of outgoing data from David's private server. I didn't just back up Mark's files in Van Nuys, Silas. I hacked David's system the moment he gave me that 7-word warning on the burner phone. I knew a man like David doesn't help for free. I found his communications with the district attorney. He's planning to hand you over tomorrow morning in exchange for full immunity. The turning point. I wasn't the victim of David's prank. I was the one who had caught him in the act. I had the real unbroken thread in my hands, and I was about to pull it. I left Silas standing in the ruins of my gallery. I didn't need his permission anymore. I had something better, his desperation. I told him I would stop David's final upload if he signed the gallery over to me, not just the lease, but the land, the assets, and a 5-year endowment. He signed it on a digital tablet in 30 seconds. But I wasn't going to save Silas. I was going to finish the job. I drove toward the Cedar Hills clinic. David thought he was safe there, protected by Jenkins's men. He didn't know Silas had just withdrawn his protection. As I drove, I thought about the anonymous donor. David's final twist. He thought that by telling me the child wasn't mine, he would break my spirit. He didn't realize that motherhood isn't about a DNA sequence, it's about what you're willing to burn down to protect a life. Sarah was still in that clinic. She was carrying a child that had been used as a pawn by every man in this story. I was the only one left who saw that child as a person. I walked into the recovery wing. David was sitting in the lounge, a glass of champagne in his hand, a laptop open on his knees. He looked up as I approached, his expression one of smug pity. "Tina," he said, standing up. "I'm sorry it had to end this way for you. But you were never part of the long-term plan. You should take the settlement Silas offered and go back to your paintings." "The plan is changing, David," I said. I didn't stop walking until I was inches from him. "I know about the immunity deal. And I know you're the one who actually authorized the foreign data sales, not Mark. You used Mark's accounts to do it, didn't you? You weren't the weak friend. You were the mastermind." David's smile faltered. "You can't prove that." "I don't have to," I said. I held up the drive from Van Nuys. "I found the original encryption keys, David. The ones with your digital signature. I've already sent them to the SEC. But I sent them with a little note, explaining how you've been managing the Jenkins family assets. The execution." I didn't wait to see David's face as they took the champagne from his hand and replaced it with steel. I didn't wait to hear his excuses. I walked past the chaos and into Sarah's room. Sarah was awake. She had heard the noise. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "It's over, Sarah," I said. I sat on the edge of her bed. "Mark is gone. David is gone. And your father is about to be very busy with his lawyers." "What about the baby?" she whispered. "The baby is a survivor," I said, taking her hand. "Just like us. And David was lying about one last thing." I pulled a small, crumpled piece of paper from my pocket. It was the real lab report I'd intercepted from David's deleted files. He didn't swap the samples for an anonymous donor, Sarah. He couldn't. The clinic's security was too tight for a man like him. He just altered the digital records to make us believe it. The child is exactly what we thought it was. The biological link was real. The dream wasn't dead. But now, the dream didn't belong to Mark. And it didn't belong to Silas. I looked at Sarah, and for the first time, we weren't the ex-wife and the new bride. We were the only two people in the world who knew the truth. "But we aren't going to tell them," I whispered. "We're going to let them think they have nothing. Because as long as they think they have nothing, they'll leave us alone. Success in the art world is often measured by the frame. You can take a masterpiece, put it in a cheap wooden border, and people will walk right past it. But put a sketch in a gilded, heavy frame under a spotlight, and they will weep at its beauty." I had spent 12 years as the frame for Mark Harrison's life. I had held him together, provided the context for his success, and allowed him to take the center of the wall. But as the sun rose over Los Angeles, painting the skyscrapers in hues of bruised gold and industrial silver, the frame was gone. Mark was in a federal holding cell, David was being processed by the SEC, and Silas Jenkins. Silas was sitting in his glass-walled office, watching his empire hemorrhage value with every tick of the stock market. I wasn't just a curator anymore. I was the one holding the spotlight. And I was about to show Silas the major consequence of trying to treat people like assets. I walked into the Jenkins corporate headquarters at 7 a.m. I didn't have an appointment. I didn't need one. The security guards, the same men who had once tried to intimidate me on a canyon road, stood aside. They had seen the news. They knew that the ex-wife was now the only person with the keys to the kingdom. I walked straight into Silas's office. He was standing at the window, his back to me. He looked smaller than he had at the wedding. The weight of the impending indictments had bowed his shoulders. "The FBI is at the Irvine office, Silas," I said. "And the SEC has frozen the accounts related to the Project X foreign data sales." David talked. He didn't even wait for a lawyer. He gave them the offshore routing numbers in exchange for a better sell. Silas didn't turn around. "I built this city, Tina. I turned orange groves into billions. And I'm going to be destroyed by a man who couldn't even keep his own marriage together." "You aren't being destroyed by Mark, Silas," I said, sitting in his leather chair, the one he called his throne. "You're being destroyed by your own arrogance. You thought you could use me to clean up your mess. You thought you could erase a child because it was inconvenient. But you forgot that a mother's memory is the most durable ledger in existence." "What do you want?" Silas asked, finally turning around. His eyes were bloodshot, his face a map of exhaustion. "You've already taken the gallery. You've already ruined Mark. What's left?" I want the Jenkins Foundation, I said. All of it. The real estate holdings, the endowment, the charitable arm. I want it restructured as a trust for the child Sarah is carrying. A trust that I control as the lead trustee. Silas let out a dry, rattling laugh. You're asking me to hand over my life's work to a woman I barely know, for a child I'm not even sure is mine. It's either that, or I hand the acquisitions folder, the one with the bribes for the Valley project, to the federal prosecutor waiting in the lobby. If you sign, I'll discover that the files were corrupted by Mark's virus. You'll lose your company, but you'll keep your freedom. You can retire to your estate in France and pretend this never happened. But the Jenkins name will no longer belong to you. It will belong to the future. The major consequence. I was stripping him of his legacy, piece by piece. I was the one doing the restructuring now. Silas signed. He didn't have a choice. He was a man who understood the math of survival, and he knew that a quiet exile was better than a loud prison sentence. He walked out of that office with nothing but his personal effects, leaving the keys to the most powerful real estate foundation in California on the desk. I stayed in that chair for a long time. I looked at the city below. It looked different from up here. It looked like a map, and for the first time, I knew exactly where I was going. I called Sarah. It's done, I said. The foundation is ours. You don't have to go back to that hometown. You don't have to hide. You're going to be the face of the new Jenkins legacy, one that isn't built on bribes and theft. Sarah was silent on the other end for a moment. And the child, Tina? What about the truth? What happens when Mark finds out from prison that the DNA swap was a lie? Mark is never getting out, Sarah. And even if he did, he has no standing. The legal document Silas just signed acknowledge me as the biological donor and you as the legal guardian. We are a closed loop. There is no room for him in this story anymore. There was one last thing I had to do. I had to see him. Not for closure, I had already closed the door, but for the execution of the final consequence. Mark sat behind the glass. He looked gray. The bespoke suits were gone, replaced by a rough orange jumpsuit that made him look like a stranger. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and desperate hope. Tina, he whispered into the phone. You have to help me. David set me up. Silas is the one who authorized the foreign sales. You have the files. You can prove it. Please, for the sake of our history. Our history is a forgery, Mark, I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. I didn't come here to help you. I came here to tell you that the child was born this morning. I lied. The child wasn't due for months. But I wanted to see the look on his face. Is it a boy? Mark asked, his eyes welling with tears. Does he have my eyes? He doesn't have anything of yours, Mark. I told you, David swapped the samples. The child is a stranger to you. You are a biological dead end. You're the end of a line that never should have started. I watched him break. I watched the last of his ego crumble into the dust of his cell. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever curated. I stood up and walked away. I didn't look back at the glass. As I walked out into the California sunshine, I felt the unbroken thread finally pull tight. The villains were in their cages, the victims were now the masters, and the secret of the child was buried under enough legal paperwork to survive a century. But as I reached my car, I saw a familiar figure leaning against the door. Julian Vane. The investor. The man Mark had tried to defraud. The man who had been watching from the sidelines since chapter 13. You did it, Tina, he said, a curious smile on his face. You took down the giants. But you should know. Arthur Vance didn't go to the airport. He's been in my office for the last 3 hours. And he has a third set of files. Files that even Mark didn't know existed. I looked at Julian. My blood turned to ice. What files, Julian? The ones from the original clinic, Tina. The one you and Mark used 12 years ago. The one where you thought the first pregnancy failed naturally. They say the truth will set you free, but they never tell you that freedom often looks like a wasteland. I stood in front of Julian Vane, the city of Los Angeles sparkling behind him like a cruel joke. 12 years. For 12 years, I believed that my first pregnancy, the one that happened before the clinics, before the hormone shots, before the desperation, had ended because my body had failed. I had carried that guilt like a stone in my gut. Every time Mark looked at me with that supportive pity, I felt smaller. But Julian was holding a folder that suggested my body hadn't failed at all. It had been sabotaged. Arthur Vance kept these as his ultimate leverage, Julian said, his voice soft. Mark paid him to make the problem go away so he could focus on his first major merger. He didn't want a child tying him down to a struggling artist wife before he'd secured his seat at the table. I opened the folder. The medical records were dated 2013. A private clinic in San Francisco. A routine checkup that ended in a tragedy I thought was natural. But there, in black and white, was the order for a chemical termination, signed by a doctor who didn't exist, authorized by a man using Mark's private business account. Mark hadn't just stolen my future with Sarah. He had murdered my past. I didn't stay in Los Angeles to celebrate my takeover of the Jenkins Foundation. I drove north. I needed to go back to the beginning. I needed to find the doctor who had held the needle. The investigation was a blur of cold coffee and dark archives. I used my new resources, the Jenkins private investigators, to hunt down the ghost of 2013. We found him in a small town outside of Eureka. Dr. Holloway. He was retired, living in a house that smelled of mothballs and old paper. He didn't recognize me at first. But when I showed him the signature on the authorization form, his hands started to shake. He told me it was what you wanted, Holloway whispered, refusing to look me in the eye. He said you were too fragile to make the decision yourself. He paid for the best care, he said it was an act of mercy. An act of mercy. That's what men like Mark call it when they take away a woman's agency. They wrap their cruelty in the language of protection. I realized then that my entire marriage wasn't a partnership, it was a long-term medical and financial experiment. Mark hadn't loved me, he had managed me. But Holloway said one more thing that made the world stop spinning. The child, it didn't end that day, Tina. There were complications. The procedure, it failed to do what he wanted. He had to move you to a second facility. I don't know what happened after that. I was paid to forget you ever walked into my office. A failed procedure. A second facility. I spent the next 3 days in a fever dream of research. If the child had survived the first attempt, where did Mark take it? I found a record of a private adoption agency, now defunct, that Mark had donated to heavily in 2014. A charity contribution that matched the exact amount of his first big bonus. I sat in a library in San Francisco, the light fading, and looked at a photo of a girl. She was 11 years old. She had raven hair, just like mine. She had the same eyes, the ones I'd spent 12 years trying to keep soft for Mark. She was living in a foster-to-adopt home in Oregon. My heart didn't just beat, it shattered. I had a daughter. A living, breathing piece of the life Mark told me was dead. While I was mourning her for a decade, she was growing up a few hundred miles away, a secret he kept in a ledger like a hidden asset. This was the first grave, the one I had been living in, thinking I was alone. I didn't go to the house with lawyers. I didn't go with the police. I went as a stranger. I needed to see her before I destroyed her world again. Her name was Maya. She was sitting on a porch swing, reading a book on art history. Of course it was art history. Some things are written in the marrow. I watched her from across the street, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned. She looked happy. The couple she lived with, the Millers, seemed kind. They were the people Mark had chosen to raise his secret. Why? Because Mr. Miller was a low-level accountant at one of Mark's shell companies. He was a man who owed Mark his career. The adoption wasn't an act of charity, it was a way for Mark to keep his insurance close. I realized then what Mark's final plan had been. If I ever left him, if I ever turned on him, he would reveal Maya. He would use her to pull me back into his orbit. Look what I saved for you, Tina. Look at the gift I kept hidden. He was waiting for the right moment to play the ultimate card. But I had found the card first. I approached the house. Not as a mother, but as a representative of the Jenkins Foundation. I told the Millers I was there to audit the corporate-sponsored housing. They let me in. They were nervous, eager to please. I sat at their kitchen table and looked at the photos on the wall. Maya at her first recital. Maya with a dog. Every photo was a knife in my heart. And then, Maya walked into the room. She looked at me, and for a second, the air left the room. It was like looking into a mirror that showed the past and the future at the same time. "Are you the lady from the gallery?" she asked. Her voice, it was my mother's voice. "I am," I said, my throat tight. "I heard you like art." "I want to see the world," she said. "But my dad, Mr. Miller, says we have to stay here. Because of the contract." The contract. Even her life was a legal binding. I looked at the Millers, and I saw the fear in their eyes. They knew the truth. They knew they were just caretakers for a billionaire's secret. I realized I couldn't just take her. If I did, the scandal would devour her. The press, the lawyers, the Jenkins enemies, they would tear her apart. I had to execute one last, perfect infiltration. I had to erase the contract and replace it with a legacy. I went back to Mark one last time. He looked even worse. He had heard rumors that I was digging in San Francisco. He knew the end was truly here. I found her, Mark, I said. He didn't scream. He didn't lie. He just closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the glass. I was going to tell you, Tina. When the time was right. When we were safe. We were never safe, Mark. Because we were with you. I pushed a document through the slot. It wasn't a confession. It was a total relinquishment of parental rights, backdated to 2014, and a full transfer of the Miller contract to the Jenkins Foundation. Sign this, I said. And I'll make sure the feds don't look into the mercy procedure of 2013. I'll make sure Holloway stays quiet. You'll stay in prison for the fraud, but you won't stay in prison for kidnapping and medical assault. You'll have a life to come back to in 20 years. If you don't sign, I'll make sure you never see the sun again. Mark signed. His hand shook so much the signature was barely legible. He was a defeated man, stripped of his lies, his money, and finally, his leverage. I walked out of that prison and didn't look back. The final settlement was done. The debts were paid. It's been a year. The Jenkins Foundation is now the Harrison Jenkins Center for Maternal Advocacy. We specialize in helping women who have been erased by the men in their lives. Sarah lives in the house in Malibu. Her daughter, the child born of the stolen dream, is thriving. She calls me Auntie Tina. We are a family of our own making, a circle of survivors that doesn't need a man to define our boundaries. And Maya? She's in the garden right now. She doesn't know the whole truth yet. She knows I'm her guardian, the woman who saved her family's home from a corporate takeover. She knows we share a love for the color blue and the way the light hits the Pacific at 4 p.m. The truth will come, in time. But for now, she has something I never had, a life that isn't a secret. I look at my hands. They aren't stained with dye anymore. They're stained with paint. I'm curating a new exhibit. It's called The Unbroken Thread. But this time, the thread isn't a leash. It's a lifeline. I am Tina. I was a ghost, a victim, and an executioner. But today? Today, I am simply a woman standing in the sun. And for the first time in my life, I am enough. We have reached the end of the story. If you have followed me from the cafe in Santa Monica to the gardens of my new life, then you know the power of the truth. Subscribe to this channel to ensure no more stories are left in the shadows. Comment unbroken below if you believe that every ghost deserves a voice.